This is going to be a principle of art, and I want to talk about how, as a principle of art, contrast can manipulate the different elements of art. Remember, the elements of art are line, color, value, shape, texture, and space. And these principles that we're learning about, like balance, contrast, um, they are all things that can kind of control the elements and direct them in different ways. So, if we think about how contrast can be used with lines to make an effective piece of artwork, this is like one first example. See how the lines kind of start off in this predictable straight way, and they curve, and they get thin or they get thicker. So that kind of contrast is happening in this work with just lines. All right, so let's talk about contrast. It's a principle of art, and we're going to be using it in one of our upcoming projects. We've actually already used it quite a bit, but we haven't formally discussed it. So I want to bring it to your attention so you're aware of it, and so you can learn how to control it better in your art. So, contrast, again, it's a principle of art, and the principles, they are ways you can manipulate and control the elements of art. So the elements of art, remember, they're line, color, value, shape, texture, space. So let's talk about and look at ways that you can have contrast of line, contrast of color, etc., and really, again, control your composition. Now this is an example of a composition just of lines, but see how these lines are contrasting? They start off at the top very straight, very vertical, and they start to curve and bend, and they form this like illusion of a circle. And this is actually called op art, optical illusion art. But this is a really fun way of contrasting your lines and getting a very specific effect. And again, this is a kind of also like an optical illusion still, but here we have lines that contrast in direction, contrast in thickness. And you kind of might remember this kind of work from your Zentangle. We talked about line variety with that, getting a variety of direction and thicknesses. And that's kind of another way of thinking about contrast. So here you can kind of see the lines contrast and then they get really thick, they end up really thin, or they start out really thin, or they go in different directions. So that's a little bit how you can kind of visualize and see contrast happening with just the element of line. And when you think of the element of shape, contrast and shapes can be all different kinds of things. They can be organic versus geometric. They can be large versus small. Here in this example of a quilt, we have shapes that are lawn and pretty dependable as far as similarity. We have these lawn rectangles, and they're contrasting with these more organically drawn rectangles. They're technically not, they look like triangles, although they're technically not, because they do have four sides. This is a nice little example of contrast of shape, and it's coming up with a really pleasing pattern in that composition. And now contrast of colors. Sorry, this is actually a little bit of a blurry image. When you're doing contrast of colors, there's different things you can think of. The most, I would say, dramatic contrast you're going to get would be from colors on the opposite side of the color wheel. So complementary colors. Here you have that orange and blue. That's complementary colors. They will provide you with the most contrast when you're looking at when you're looking to achieve that. Another example of color contrast would be here with the bottles and the apples. And again, this is an example of complementary color contrast. We have purple and yellow, and then we have green and red, all complementary pairs. But really good examples of how to get a lot of high contrast with just color alone. And here we have value. So this is a nice example of value contrast, and that's when you have lights and darks in the same composition. So this close-up for the flower is getting you a really nice example of how to have incredible light areas and then pure dark, and how it's really working well as a composition to be dramatic. Now, we haven't done a whole lot of value contrast with color. We did make the color wheel, which is showing you how tints, tones, and shades could have different values. Here you can kind of see that happening, where in this composition by Vermeer, you do have color that is showing you a range of values as well. So even though it is color, it still has all those values. That's giving you a nice dramatic effect. Now texture is a fun one. It's a little harder to do with paint and pencil, but with sculpture it's quite easy. So this is called the Garden of Stones. It's a monument to the Holocaust by Annie Goldsworthy. Here you have oak trees that are growing out of stones. A really beautiful living contrast with texture. This is an artist that I'm a huge fan of. He does great stonework, and he always has a great contrast with his work. So here it almost looks like the stone would be so soft it could bend, and it's contrasted with a shiny, non-porous knife. So it's a very, dull surface, very porous surface, and a huge contrast with that knife there. This other work by him is one of my favorites because it's such a contrast with the shiny teeth and the zipper and then the rocks. These are just such great little sculptures. So fun. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to use contrast in our pop art project. So let's talk about specifically how Andy Warhol, who we're going to use as inspiration for the project, how he uses contrast. Here you can kind of see this image has high contrast, right? We have a contrast of warm and cool colors because we have, a contrast of bright and dull colors. So we have this really bright yellow, and then we have more of a dull skin tone, kind of a tone. Then we have another bright pink for the eyelashes in the background. Now, when you're thinking of value, you can also see these colors do have a big range of value. Specifically, the hair is very light when you contrast it with the dark shadows of the hair, and the face. It's a really nice value contrast when you do make it black and white. You can kind of see though that the skin and the eyeshadow, they don't offer a whole lot of value contrast. What they're really doing is offering color contrast. So the reason this pops is because this pink is a hue and the skin tone is a tone. So from your color wheel, there are different places on the wheel. So this is really what's getting you that contrast here. Now, Andy Warhol, he's a famous pop artist. He's known for doing portraits, also specifically known for doing Marilyn Monroe, and he would often do this kind of tile presentation where he'd have more than one portrait up at once, and we're going to be doing something similar with our work. We're going to be doing portraits, and they're going to be using color, and we're going to be doing 4 at a time, so 2 rows of 2. And you can kind of see here in all of his work, he really does have high contrast. Here we have the warm and cool contrast of the blue and the yellow. We also have another hue versus tone contrast, and then even tint versus shade, because we have this lighter skin tone with the darker shadows. So that's a little bit about contrast. Now what I want you to do to demonstrate that you understand contrast is come up with 4 or 5 photographs that visualize contrast in these categories. A photograph that has a shape contrast, a color contrast, a value contrast, a texture contrast, and a mood contrast. So shape with this would mean you want to get a photograph that has in the composition a contrast of shapes. And you can decide if that's because they're small and large shapes, if they're organic and geometric shapes. Again, up to you. For color, you can decide if it's light and dark color, if it is warm and cool color, totally your choice, but a photograph that would have 2 contrasting colors in it. And then value, same thing, lights and darks in one image. You want to find a photograph or create a photograph that has a texture contrast. And the last one, the mood contrast, is maybe going to be the most difficult, but also probably the most original. So come up with a photograph that demonstrates some kind of contrast and mood. Now, these should all be photographs that you actually take. You're not going on the internet and trying to find these kind of photographs. You're walking around in your environment and either taking photographs of what you see or arranging a composition and then taking a photograph of that. And this is what you're going to be uploading to Canvas for this assignment. And then that's it for contrast.